Welcome back, Sweet Chris here. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at roles and permissions. And the name is pretty self-explanatory. Roles are really those vehicles in which you access the system, how things are configured for you really relate to your role. And then the permissions is where we give you your accessibility into certain types of tools, features, and records. And roles and permissions as a whole subject is something that's really the bread and butter of an administrator function for a company, as well as new consultants in training. So it's something you really want to have an excellent grip on, not just to make your life easier when doing that role, but also it's a core component of your Suite Foundation certification exam. So you want to make sure you understand it well to also progress up those levels of certification. Now, before I actually dive into NetSuite, I want to point out that in this video, I'm going to be covering a bunch of things very rapidly because I have to kind of cram it into one video. However, I do have an administrator's course that I made about 6 months ago that really breaks out roles and permissions into 5 videos. I go into a lot more detail with examples, etc., additional features that I don't cover in this video. So if you want a more holistic view of that feature, then definitely check out that course. And I also have other courses for accountants, project management. I have a whole prep course for the Suite Foundation exam. I believe it's the only one that exists. So if any of these things are interesting to you in your role, then by all means, check out my website. And with that, let's get into roles and permissions. So I'm here in my home dashboard and I'm currently in the administrator role. So to get to the actual roles and permissions options, we're going to come to setup. We'll go down to users roles. And then there's a few different things here, but really where you're going to be doing the majority of things related to roles and permissions is in manage roles. So if I click on that, all right, and what we have here is basically a list of all the roles that are available on this particular NetSuite instance. And you can see here, they're either custom or they're standard roles. So the best way to think about this is the standard roles are really like templates, and that's the way you should treat them. The best practice is to take the standard roles and instead of assigning those to people, take them as templates and then customize them and save them so that they're now custom roles. And then you'll give out those custom roles. So you kind of always have your standard roles as templates that you can then modify and make tweaks to and then pass those out as custom roles. It is not generally advisable to create a role from scratch. I know you can see the feature up here, but there's so much that goes into a role. There's so many different permissions and just little aspects of it that it's quite a lengthy and tedious process to do it from scratch. It's much easier to take an existing role that you know and make modifications to it so that you can get some kind of custom role that's more useful for your requirements. So we can come down this and you can see here I've got an HR manager role. You can see this is a custom role and this is the one we're going to be editing. So we'll click on that. And it brings us to, this is basically the roles and permissions page for this particular HR manager role. And just to make it simple, I'm going to give a lot of different examples as I go through this. Let's say we have one particular employee in mind, Joe, and he's going to be taking on the HR manager role. So this is kind of who we have in mind. And as we go through, you'll see there's others that can also use this role. So I'll give examples of that. So I'm really just going to take this from the top down and I'm going to explain there's a lot of different features here. Many of them are applicable in most instances. I generally try to kind of limit things down to just what you really need to know, but there's just so much applicable information here that I'm going to cover as much as really is relevant in most cases. So the first thing I want to comment on, obviously you have the name. So you're going to be taking that standard role and customizing it. So you want to come up with a name that's going to be very relevant for you. And generally for consultants, they'll oftentimes put the actual company name as the first initials so that it's clear that that was a custom role made for your organization. The next thing we have here is the accounting center, or really the center that you're dealing with. So the important thing to understand, in case you don't know what a center is, I often refer to it as the navigation bar. It's this blue bar at the top here. It dictates what tabs you have there, what features are within those tabs, and there's a handful of centers. Common ones are like the sales center, accounting center. These centers are basically assigned by role. When you're first creating a role, you will dictate what center you want to attach with that role. But once you actually create that role, it's actually locked in at that point. You can't just go and change it from an accounting center to a sales center. You always have the ability to default to the classic center, which an administrator, that's what you're seeing right now. But to change it between other centers is not possible. So you do want to make sure you get that center correct in the first place. So in this case, you can see the HR manager role is using the accounting center, and you can also see it's inline text, so I cannot edit it and change it to something else. Coming down from that, we have the employee restrictions. So you'll see as we go through this, there's kind of layers of permissions and restrictions. Some of them will overlap, some of them will apply in different ways. This one is really the first layer that we're going to deal with. So there's 4 different types of employee restrictions. I'll take it from the bottom up. So first off, we have own and subordinates only. So like I said at the beginning, let's say we're dealing with Joe and he's going to take on this role. So in this case, if we select own and subordinates only, this would only be records that are directly tied to Joe or his subordinates. Those are the only records and tools and features that he can interact with. Up from that, we have a slightly broader range of restriction, which is own, subordinate, and unassigned. So let's say he was in a sales position. If it was own and subordinate, it would only be, let's say, leads, prospects, things that relate just to him or his subordinates. But as soon as you select own, subordinate, and unassigned, if there is a prospect that comes along that has not been assigned to a specific sales rep, Joe would also be able to access that prospect. And also notice when you click on it, it makes this checkbox available. And if you click allow viewing, it means that not only is he limited to being able to interact with his own and subordinate ones, but he could also view ones that, let's say, a different sales rep or a different sales manager has. He could still view them, though he wouldn't be able to edit or have other interactions with those records. So if we take that off, the next 2 levels up, they're really both the same, which is none. In other words, no restrictions. And while you might be hesitant to just blanketly say, well, this employee has no restrictions, again, keep in mind, we're going to have other restrictions coming up later. So it's not uncommon to set the restrictions as none for a lot of different roles. And there's really 2 ways you can break it down. There's none, no default. So that's basically saying that this field is null, like it's not going to have effect on anything. Down from that, we have default to own. And that's basically saying that while it's true this person doesn't have any restrictions, or the role I should say, it is going to default in certain instances that are applicable to something that relates to the HR manager role. For example, let's say if the HR manager is in a subsidiary for US West, then it will, in instances, it will default to that subsidiary. So that's just something to keep in mind. In many instances, that is useful to have. All right, then we have these checkboxes over here. I'll try to go through these pretty rapidly. The first one, do not restrict employee fields. So there are a number of instances in certain records where you'll have a list feature that will have employee records. For example, if you're assigning a customer and who is the contact in your organization for that customer, you'll have a drop-down list of all employees. If you want it where it is all employees and it's not restricted to only a few employees, you would want to select this box. So it's not restricting that list. If you do have a reason to have it more limited, let's say for sales representatives, you only want them to have a certain amount of options to deal with, then you would want to have that selected. Next, we have restrict time and expenses. So you should be familiar with the concept of time and expenses. This is basically saying that you're restricting so that, let's say Joe in this case, he's not going to be able to go and log time and expenses for a different employee. He might be able to view it, but he won't be able to actually log for them. He will be restricted just to his own or his own subordinates. So then we have sales roles, support roles, and partner roles. All 3 of these do the same thing, which is basically a very rapid way to add a restriction based on the fact that, let's say it's a sales rep, he's going to be restricted just to, let's say, forecasts, prospects, things that relate to him. Similarly with a support, if you've got a support employee who's handling support tickets, etc., and you only want to limit it so he can see and interact with support cases that are tied to him or his territory, you would want to select that. Down from that, we have inactive. Obviously, if this is a custom role you're no longer using, you would select it as inactive. You also can do it where you have the standard roles that you copy to create these custom roles. And the way you would do that is you'd open a standard role, you make the modifications you want, and you come up here and you hit save as. So that would make that custom role. And then you can go to the standard roles and select them as inactive. That way, those are kind of off the table, so you don't accidentally start assigning those roles out. Down from that, we have this last feature, core administration permissions. This is actually not a permanent feature. It's something that NetSuite created temporarily to handle kind of a specific issue, which is what if you have a role that really should have restrictions and just a certain amount of permissions, but either for an amount of time or maybe for a particular person that's handling that role, you want to give them very broad permissions, let's say almost like administrator permissions. And for example, if you had a developer who was creating things for your system, in general, you might not want that person to have far-reaching features, but because they're programming things for your system, you might need them to have basically administrator permissions. So you could select this checkbox and it gives them a host of permissions they wouldn't naturally have. Now, if you want to know the specifics of exactly what that's influencing, there is an article on Suite Answers if you just look up core administrator permissions, and it will give you all the information about what it allows them to do or not do. So you should just be aware of that. Down from that, we have this restrictions field up here. And keep in mind, we're in the header level of this record, right? When we get down to the subtabs, there's a lot of other things we can do down there, but some of the key things were placed up in this header section. And subsidiary restriction is definitely one of them. Now, keep in mind, subsidiary is just one of the 4 segment types, right? You have subsidiary, department, class, and location. The other 3, you can assign restrictions by those, but they're placed down here in the restrictions subtab. Subsidiary was taken and put up in the main header section. And really what this is doing is it's a quick way to assign how is this person, let's say Joe in this role, how is he restricted by subsidiary? So if he's a US West guy, do we want to, and in many cases you would want to limit him to just US West. You don't want him seeing records and interacting with, let's say, customers that are in US East, because that's not his territory. So in that case, you would select it as the user subsidiary. But you might have instances with maybe even something like an HR manager or accounting where you want them to be able to go between subsidiaries, and you can either do specific subsidiaries or you could have it be all subsidiaries, whatever is applicable for your particular use. Down from that, we have this authentication section. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but one thing I do want to point out is this is where you select whether this role has to do a 2-factor authentication. Now, administrators have 2FA as a default. In terms of who else you give it to, the best practice is really assign it as a priority for roles that have broad permissions and a lot of capability in the system. So things like payroll officers, that kind of thing, you might want to make sure that those individuals have a 2-factor authentication to add that extra level of security to make sure that that role and that access doesn't fall into other people's hands. So that's something to be aware of. Now we come down into the subtab area. And again, this is where a lot of the meat of the roles and permissions is. And specifically, the permissions is, I would say, the most important. So this is where, as you can imagine, all the either the records or the actions that are possible are listed out, and your permission level for that thing is going to be listed out. And they've actually broken it down just so it's not a massive list. They have it categorized by like transactions, various report permissions, what can they set up. Obviously, as an administrator, I have quite a bit of permissions in general. So really what I want to talk about here, the most important thing to take away from permissions is the permission level. So that's dictating, well, how much permission does somebody have with that particular thing? And we've got purchase orders down here. So let's take purchase orders as our kind of example throughout. There's 5 levels. What are they? The first one is none. So that would say that Joe in this role has no access. He can't do anything. He can't even see purchase orders. Up from that, we have view. And view is where you can obviously see purchase orders, but you can't do anything else with them. The third level is create. So Joe could create a purchase order, but otherwise has no capabilities. And then the fourth is edit. So he can create them. He can also make modifications and changes to those purchase orders. And the last one, which is referred to as full, you can see that here. really can be considered delete, because in addition to all the previous permissions, like the ability to create, edit, etc., you now have the ability to also delete that type of record. So for example, with purchase orders, Joe can create it and also delete some purchase orders. So those are the 5 levels. But one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times these permission levels don't just interact with this one thing that you're touching, but depending on what you're doing in the system, because NetSuite is a relational database, these permission levels can sometimes affect things beyond just what you would consider. For example, if you're importing a bunch of purchase orders into the system, you need to think with not just what are your permissions for the import function, but also you need to make sure that your purchase order permission specifically would be minimally at create, because you're going to be pulling those records in and creating new purchase orders. If you're doing what's called an add update import, where it's pulling them in, it's also making modifications to existing purchase orders, then you would minimally have to have a permission level on purchase orders at edit to be able to actually have that occur. So that's permissions. Over from that, we have restrictions. So it's pretty straightforward. You can select the segment. So I commented on subsidiary being above, and let's say you go, okay, I want to give this role a restriction based on department. I can select that, and then I can come in here and I can state what is that level of restriction. Just like we saw with the employee restrictions above, you can have it limited to either just the person and his subordinates, maybe his subordinates as well as the unassigned, or no restrictions, but it will default to things related to him specifically. So you have those, and again, you could do it for any segment. So that's pretty straightforward. Employee access, this is actually something specific to a feature I have enabled on this demo account. It's not common in most accounts, so I'm actually not going to comment on that one specifically. And I'm going to jump over to forms. So if I scroll down here, we have a list of all of these different types of forms. And when I talk about forms, really what I mean is, let's say I open this purchase order that we're talking about. If I go to this purchase order, you can see what we're seeing here, right? This way of interacting with this purchase order is dictated by this form over here. So it's got this one set as default for me, but I've got a bunch of additional ones. And if I change it to a different form, notice what we see here changes. In this case, didn't change very much, but there was a couple additional fields that were added. So you can have forms that are wildly different from one to the next. And there are certain instances where you might want one form to be used. And sometimes with specific roles, you want to limit them to certain forms. The way you would do that is when you come to roles, when we're on this form subtab, you come in here, and as you can see in these columns, the left-hand column enabled, that just means like, is this form an option at all? So you can see all of these are checked, and you can see obviously the category of things. So let's actually come down to purchase orders. Okay, so you can see we've got a ton of different purchase orders here, right? They've all got a specific name. And the column on the right is actually whether we want to have this as the preferred form, which is another way of saying the default. So just like when I opened that purchase order, there was already defaulted one particular form. But let's say I wanted this particular one to be preferred. In this case, I'm in the HR manager role. So I want Joe, when he's in this role, I want this to be his preferred form. So I could click here, and now when he opens a purchase order, this is going to be the one that he sees. However, he still has the ability to change the form to a different one if he wants. In some instances, you don't want that, and you want to actually restrict Joe or any HR manager to one particular form. The way you would do that is by, notice when we selected this as preferred, it actually enabled, we now have this one open, and this is the restrict column. So I can select that, and it means that he can only use that one particular form. He has no other option. And of course, by doing that, it makes all of these other enabled forms now not enabled, because he's not going to be able to select those if he so chooses. And of course, the same applies to all of these. And if we come to the top here, you can see just like with permissions, because there's so many different options, they break it down by category. So you just go to the sublist that's applicable. Okay, so next up is searches. And one thing I want to bring to your attention is up until forms, we've been talking about permissions and restrictions. Everything's really been centered around what can this person do and what are we going to block them from doing. When we get from forms on, we're really talking more about defaults. So not necessarily restrictions, but more just when this role is interacting with different things, what do we want them to kind of default to? And when we're talking about searches specifically, so if this role is dealing with, let's say, a saved search, what are the defaults that we want to set up for this person in terms of where this saved search will appear, what kind of filters will be defaulted for that saved search, the criteria, etc. And the way it gets broken down, I know this is a lot of fields here, but really we're doing a similar thing that we just did on forms. So for example, list view, you can set the default for this person's list view. You can also set, do you want to restrict him to that list view? Same thing for the dashboard view. What's the default? Do I want to restrict him to that? And the same for the sublist and the restriction. So these are all just kind of groupings together where you can set those defaults and dictate if the person is actually restricted to that type of view for searches. Next up, we have users. Now, in this particular case, we only have one employee. I've been giving Joe as an example, but there's an actual employee in this demo account named Gina Parker, and she is the only person that actually is currently using this HR manager role. This is a really handy place to come to see, let's say if you have a sales rep role and there's 20 employees that are in that role, it's sometimes nice to see, okay, if I'm making these changes, who's this actually going to influence? And you might see an employee on there that you go, oh, well, if I do this, that's going to restrict that person's ability to do their job. And you might want to think about, okay, do I potentially break this role off into 2 roles and give certain employees that second role? And there's another way you can get around that, which I'm going to show a little bit later in this video. But this is just a great place to see who this is interacting with. And then we come over here to preferences. Now, if you remember up here, we've got set preferences. So that's where we're going to be setting preferences really just for ourselves, and oftentimes ourselves within one particular role. So if we have many, it oftentimes will only influence the role that we're currently in. Here's where we can set for this role if we want to basically dictate what the preferences are for this role. We could do it here. And a really simple example that's maybe not very applicable, but it's easy to understand, is if you wanted to change the color theme. So let's say your company had the color theme as green and you want all of the different employees to always have the color theme be as green. You could come in here and you could select color theme and you could set it as green. You could select of any one of these, set that, and it would default them to that particular color theme. So that's pretty straightforward. Next up, we have dashboard. Again, not much to talk about here. It's really just stating if this person has a specific published dashboard as opposed to the one that comes out of the box for that particular role. So that's really all the main features that relate to roles and permissions on a particular role. But there's another side of the coin, which is features relating to particular employees and the various roles and permissions that one employee can have, as opposed to a role that can be taken on by many employees. So let's take a look at that. Let's say we come up to this employee record. So we're on this record for Abby Kwan. So this is one particular employee in this demo account. And a couple things I want to show you on this. The first thing is that when you're on a particular employee record, you can kind of dictate what that employee is considered as a resource. So for example, if I scroll down here, we have this project section, and I can dictate that this Abby is a project resource. So she can be considered in the system as a resource. When you're doing drop-down lists of various project resources, she will appear on that list. Also, when you come down to the human resources subtab, there's a few different checkboxes that are similar. So you could say that she is a support rep, maybe a project manager, or a sales representative. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now we're going to come up to the access subtab. If I click on that, notice there's really 3 things I want to show you on this subtab. The first is that this is where we can come to give access for an employee to get onto NetSuite in the first place. Many employees have no reason to go onto NetSuite and they will not have access. But when you do have one, let's say you hire a new inventory manager, they need to access NetSuite, you can come in here and you can select give access, and then you can dictate, you don't have to give them a password, you can simply send them an email by selecting this, and it will require them to set their own email, or you could make a manual email and then they can reset it when they first log in, however you want to do that. All of these features are very straightforward. The second thing I want to show you is this is where we dictate what is the role that this person even has. So in the example we've been using, we can create that HR manager custom role, but we also need to come into Joe's record specifically, and we need to give him the role of HR manager. That will give him access to that in the first place. You can also have an instance where one employee has multiple roles that they're going to be accessing. For example, You can see an employee center here, so it's not uncommon to have every employee will have an employee center as well as their main production role. Or you might have one employee, let's say the CFO, who also needs to access NetSuite as a controller or as an accounts receivable clerk. So you could add all those roles here, and he would be able to have those as an option in the far right corner here. The last thing I want to point out, which is very important, is the global permissions. So if we're talking about the HR manager role, and up until now, we've just been saying that Joe is the person accessing this, but let's say there's really 4 different people that are going to be using the HR manager role, and Joe's kind of the senior of the bunch. So instead of creating a second role just for him, we want to just have one custom HR manager role, and we want to give Joe specific global permissions that go above and beyond what the HR manager role can usually do. And it's very basic. It's just like in the permissions feature that I showed you earlier. You come in here, if it was for purchase orders, you would select purchase orders, and you'd come over here and give a higher level of permission for that particular thing. The last thing I want to show you is if we come up to setup and we go down to users and roles again, notice up here we have show role differences. So I'm going to click on that. I'll say leave on this field. So this is a great tool, especially when you're first creating roles or you're making adjustments to roles. You can use this tool to really gain a lot of information by comparing whatever role you're looking at, or multiple roles if necessary, to a baseline role. So let's say you have an employee who is trying to do something as part of their job, but the system's not allowing them. They're getting some kind of restriction block and you can't figure out why. What you can do is find a role that you know doesn't have that same problem, and you can do a comparison of those 2 roles to try to figure out exactly what kind of permission could be creating the issue. So let's say Joe is in this role of HR manager, and we know that he can't do something specific, but the HR administrator has no problem doing that. So we can come down here and we can say, okay, we're going to take Joe's role of HR manager and we're going to compare that to the base role of HR administrator. And we only want to look at the differences. We could hit show, and it pulls up this really handy list of all the various permissions and restrictions. And you can see back to back between these 2, or more if you want, what are their differences. And that's where, again, it's usually useful to take 2 roles that are similar, but one's not having this problem. And you can just go through the things that you know are somewhat related to whatever the problem is. And then you'll see, oh, wow, this guy has full, but in the role that we're trying to handle, it only has create. Maybe that's the problem. You could tinker with that, check it, and see if that solves the problem you're running into. So it's just a great tool all around. There's many different ways that you can utilize it. And that's it for roles and permissions. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.